2025 meeting of the Budget, Finance, and Audit Committee of the Housing Opportunities Commission. I'm Roy Peace, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined today by two other committee meeting members. To my immediate left, Jeff Merkowitz, who's Chair, Vice Chair of the Board, and also to my right, I have a minute, but always a commissioner. Too early for me this morning. I have all these names running through my head. One of the things I learned years ago was when you do meetings, despite how well you know people, write your name down. Because invariably you're going to make a mistake. I've learned that. I wasn't following that this morning. But welcome to our meeting. The first item of the agenda today is the approval of the Budget and Finance Committee minutes of October 1st, 2025. Got to get a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
I'll second it. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye and aye. Minutes are approved. We have two discussion items for the agenda today. The first one is the calendar year 2026 portfolio budgets. And I'll turn to our President, Chelsea Andrews.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the HOC team, and members of the public. This item is coming before you for your review and approval to advance our recommendations for a certain number of properties that are in our portfolio. Commissioners, as you know, we own over 57 properties. A number of them fall in a certain category on a calendar year basis because of their status, either in the low-income housing tax credit program or their structure as a LLC. Today, you will hear recommendations in regards to our budgets for the 15 calendar year LIHTC partnership properties, as well as two additional properties, the Lindley and the Laureate. I'd like to turn it over to our finance team, both our CFO, Tim Getzinger, as well as Terry Fowler, our budget officer, will present this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Andrews. See, you got me there. Thank you, President Andrews. Commission. For the record, Tim Getzinger, I should have wrote that down too, Senior VP of Finance and CFO. See, I was doing you a favor. The biggest takeaway here, and our budget officer, Terry Fowler, is going to provide the details, is that this provides only a moderate revenue stream, about $177,000 through different management fees. One additional way that it could potentially provide some positive impact to our operating budget, if the properties do very well through the waterfall, through the different agreements that we have, there might be seller notes or other deferred developer fees that it would provide to us. Those are very difficult to project, so we are not doing that in here. We are projecting the management fees, but the rest of the information in here in terms of expenses and revenue, all of that good stuff, our budget officer is going to provide. But the biggest takeaway is that it is a moderate amount of revenue for the fiscal year budget. And with that, presenting this item is Terry Fowler, our budget officer.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, Commissioners, President Andrew, viewing public, and HOC staff. As was mentioned, this is our calendar year portfolio. It is comprised of 17 tax credit partnerships that include 19 individual properties, as well as the Lindley and the Laureate. Staff met with our new leaders of property management and asset management to reevaluate the continuing impacts the agency sees from COVID-19, specifically how it's affecting our lease enforcement. You saw that when we adopted the fiscal 26 agency budget, we see the same things in these properties. So we have looked at the budgets and evaluated how long we anticipate those impacts to be. So we do see greater impact in the first half of calendar 26. This is our best forecast for this, but please keep in mind that it in some ways is out of our control because we are dependent on both the court systems and the sheriff's department to reinforce our lease enforcement. And we have seen negative impacts through that change the course of action or the timing we anticipated these actions to take. So you will see in this portfolio that we have greater vacancy loss in the beginning of the calendar year, as well as the maintenance cost that is associated with turning those units and reoccupying them with revenue generating customers. And that also affects the bad debt as we linger through the court systems to put into effect what needs to happen. So we do want everybody to keep that in mind as we go into this. As President Andrews mentioned, typically this portfolio only includes tax credit properties, but we do have 2 partnerships that operate on a calendar year basis, and therefore those 2 properties are presented in this portfolio. If we can turn to page 3 of the packet. Thank you. As was mentioned, the cash flow is restricted to these properties. However, if a stabilized property is projecting an operating deficit, then the agency is responsible for covering that deficit. Lasco Manor, which is a small 12-unit building that supports low-income tenants in Bethesda, has historically operated at a deficit. It is projecting a deficit of approximately $85,000 this year. That does include the management fee that is paid to HOC, and you may wonder why charge the fee if it operates at a deficit. We have had experience in years where that deficit did not occur, and in those years, the fee was taken and the property did actually cash flow. So this affords us the ability to be paid the fee for overhead. If there is a deficit at year end, yes, we give the fee back, but this is the structure of the budget and the plan for the property. The rent increases in this portfolio, for the most part, fall within the current county guideline of 3.3%. We do have properties in this portfolio that are project-based rental assistance and follow OCAF. And we have one property, specifically Waverly House, that for those units is projecting a 4.6% rent increase, which is based on the most recent OCAF for Maryland. If we turn to page 8 of the packet, and I realize that it is small, but I'm focusing on the right side of the packet. As Tim mentioned earlier, the cash flow is restricted, and there is a structure whereby fees are paid to the limited partner first, and that is the asset management or investor service fee. If sufficient cash flow is available after the payment of those fees, a partnership fee is paid to HOC. This budget is projecting those fees at $170,000 for this year, which is an increase of 3.9%. or $3,900 from the budget of 25. All properties are expected to have sufficient cash flow to pay the full fees, with the exception of Lasco Manor as a result of the deficit projected there. The anticipated net cash flow when compared to the fiscal 25 budget is down to 3.8 million from 5.7 million projection for 25. But as mentioned previously, the impact of COVID has continued, and the actual cash flow that will be experienced in 25 will not meet the budgeted expectations. In addition to those impacts, the Leggett has debt service budgeted for a full year in calendar 26, whereas in calendar 25, it was a partial year based on when the property would stabilize following the renovations. If we move to page 11 of the packet, as mentioned numerous times, it feels like the story just continues. We do see many of the properties in this portfolio experiencing the impacts of COVID. As mentioned before, this will continue at least for the first half of the year, and we have 10 properties that are projecting to experience decreased NOI, and they range in magnitude. The 7 remaining properties are projecting NOI increases averaging 3.9%. If we move to page 12 of the packet. The minimum debt service coverage ratio requirement of 1.15 to 1 or higher is projected to be achieved for all of the properties with the exception of Alexander House, which is projecting 1.12, and the Leggett, which is projecting 1.05. If we can go back to page 8 to discuss the two non-tax credit properties briefly. The laureate projects effective income to remain flat with higher gross rents and parking income, which is offset by the higher vacancy loss. One thing I do want to mention is also in the operating expenses, they are growing 17.8%. The largest contributing factor is the taxes that are to be paid on the retail portion of the property. Those taxes, because there is a pilot on the rental portion where mistakenly not budgeted in 25, we have put those in based on the recent tax bill that was paid. Again, that is related to the retail portion. So it does increase the operating expenses. This results in an NOI decrease of 7.9%, and the debt service coverage ratio goes from 1.09 to 1 for this period of time. The Lindley is projected to show a decrease of 21% in revenue. That is due to the treatment of the payment for the mezzanine lender. This has flipped back and forth over the years. The funding for that mezzanine payment is drawn from the OHRF. It's approximately $1.6 million annually. And we have had different treatment where we would show the funding coming from the OHRF and the payment on the property. Our auditors have told us to put that on the balance sheet. So therefore, the operating income goes down, but you see a corresponding decrease in the same amount on the debt service. However, that does negatively impact your NOI because you only see one side of that entry. If we were to exclude that, income would only have gone down 0.4%. And again, that is mainly due to the challenges with occupancy. If we look at the operating expenses for the property, they are projecting to increase 5.1%, again, due to bad debt and maintenance costs. So although the NOI, as I mentioned previously, is going down 30% because of the removal of the draw from the OHRF, debt service coverage is actually going up from 1.07 to 1.08 because of the treatment of that debt. Are there any questions on the operating budgets of the properties before I move briefly to capital?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. As I went through the materials for today, the one thing that really struck me was the horrifying increases in the operating costs on many of the properties, so in excess of 10% compared to the limited increase in rents of 3.3%. And I was harkened back to an article that I discovered recently that was written by Enterprise Community Partners, actually the ESSEC, they're a syndicator in LISC in New York, talking about distress in New York's affordable housing stock, and a similar article coming out of Seattle. And both articles mentioned the same challenges we're having about occupancy and rent collections, but also this extraordinary increases in insurance costs, and in our memo, higher personnel, utility, maintenance costs. And I guess, I don't know, it's registering concern on my part about the future of the portfolio and not just the LIHTC portfolio, but our portfolio in general. I guess I'm just throwing that as a comment, but we welcome kind of assuaging my concerns.
Well, it is our current reality.
Yeah.
And so, of course, our team is working really hard to, one, provide a budget that's realistic. What we did not want to do is be overly conservative and show that these expenses are real. At the same time, we're working very closely with our third-party property managers on how we can reduce expenses. We're exploring opportunities to even do a more holistic procurement of some of the goods that are provided across our properties, trying to think about requiring our third-party property managers to all use certain companies that we're able to negotiate discounts with. So we're thinking really creatively on how we can reduce expenses across the portfolio, but there are increases that we're experiencing, and it's reflected here, where we are also able to try to offset that by really stabilizing our portfolio as it pertains to moving as swiftly as possible with unit turns and completing lease enforcement. We're also taking those steps. And so I think that we'll have a better picture of how our portfolio fares once we are able to turn the page that we've been on for quite some time of lease enforcement. I'm hopeful that with everything that we're currently experiencing, that we won't have yet another wave of challenges with individuals paying their rent. And so we're really just trying to get to a place of stabilization as it pertains to both the occupancy as well as lease enforcement, and also looking very closely and thinking creatively on how we could reduce expenses.
Yeah, two of the big drivers of the concern industry right now are utility costs, which are exogenous. They're imposed upon us.
Mm-hmm.
But the other one's insurance. And my understanding is that we're relatively protected from what's going on in the broader insurance industry because we were able to participate in the county's self-insurance program.
Yes, for the most part. There's certain properties where we have to take additional policies out based on that particular property and or certain circumstances. But I will say that we are fortunate to be able to piggyback off of the county's insurance.
And just to expand upon that, as President Andrew mentioned, for the multifamily, each of the properties does, in addition to the county insurance, have private liability insurance. One thing we were able to do that has positively impacted 4 of the properties remaining in this portfolio is get the investor, the LIHTC investor, to agree to accept the county insurance for the basic property insurance. That affects the 3 Willow Manors and Green Hills in here. So we have significant reductions for next year's budget as well as this year's actual cost, because that acceptance went into place in September of 25. So that will greatly reduce the overall cost for insurance for those properties. On our fiscal budget, that impacted Forest Oak Towers because we were also recently able to get that accepted on the county insurance. So at this point, with the exception of the private liability that's covered, all of our properties are on the county insurance.
Yes. It's interesting. On one hand, from the standpoint, we've got to deal with, tenants who are not paying and actions we take. And then we get into, once we get the property vacant, we've got the unit turn time. What are you finding? Are we able to truncate that time for turn and lease up at this period of time differently than maybe you were last year this time?
I could weigh in there. As you may recall, we restructured our contracts with our property management companies to reduce the turn time. Previously, there was coordination and collaboration between our maintenance division and third-party property managers that created some delay. Since we've restructured, it is required that our third-party property managers also handle the turns. So they know when a property is getting ready for an eviction. They have a certain amount of time to get that unit back up online. And so I've not heard any complaints or challenges in terms of the length of time it's taking to get our units back online. Especially with these changes that we've made in the past, that was an issue we were experiencing.
Yeah, because it would seem like given the demand for affordable housing, is finding a tenant to go back into a vacant unit would be very easy to do. Even though I know that we go through a number of ways that we take people off our waiting list and all those kind of things to do that. But I'm sure that your lease up staff is working very closely, even with our third party property managers, to make sure that time is also shortened.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because all of them impact the costs that go on these projects, but we lose revenue all the time that somebody's not in the unit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing I asked about is one of the major drivers is also Paul was identifying as personnel costs. And so it's interesting, but not a mystery, that when we have a staff that we pay benefits to, and we try to make sure that we remain competitive as good, good employers, that has an impact on the cost that ultimately goes to the property where personnel costs are being charged against that property.
Right. And we do know that the management companies have strived to get high quality staff personnel at each of our properties. And there are times when that replacement cost is higher than the incumbent that may have been at the property. In addition, you have the normal increases of salaries and benefit costs. So when we identify that personnel costs went up, none of them were exorbitant increases, but they were part of the overall increase in operating expenses at the properties. But they do not stand out as being out of the range of normalcy.
Yeah. I also find it interesting that 3 of our newer properties, the Lindley, Leggett, and Alexander House, which is not new, but it's been redeveloped, 3 properties that, are struggling sometimes with lease up. And I know there are different reasons for different properties. Like the Lindley, I was talking to our president about the Lindley, because I remember when we opened the Lindley, it was a premier property. I remember the grand celebration when the Lindley opened. At the same time, we also knew that there were other properties that were already not only in the queue, but were getting ready to start construction. So we were building, so the market was creating competition for leasing, right as we were leasing up our property. And so and when you drive past there now, I go by there often, the Lindley, which was like, you could see it right from the road from Connecticut Avenue. You can't hardly even see the building now. Because of the buildup of all the other properties around it. And many of them have amenities that we don't have in the Lindley, like retail or things like that. So I know that's the situation there. And, but it's interesting that as we create these new properties, that they come with also a lot of other kinds of challenges which don't go necessarily to the pro forma.
Places where we've helped create the market.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
True.
Just building on some of what's already been asked. I guess I had been thinking, and particularly in terms of the debt service coverage and like what's driving, like whether the main drivers of some of these shortfalls is more on the revenue side with the lease enforcement in particular, or whether it's the operating expenses, which, as Paul rightly points out, is concerning. But like to the extent that, do we think that, once we are able to stabilize, we get ourselves back in good position with the DSC, that the operating expenses are maybe concerning but manageable, or is the driver more on the expense side?
I would say that the biggest driver has really been the lease enforcement and the revenue side in our portfolio. Surely we're looking at expenses, and as you all have noted, where there's properties where the expenses seem to have some large variables since last year. Even with our new vice president of property management on board, there's a heightened level of attention on those expenses and getting those as low as possible. But what we really need to experience is our property stabilizing and getting through all of the bad debt and some of the challenges that we've had there. And so it really, I believe, once we get to that stage, will give us a better picture of how each asset is performing. But each property has its own story. And it's really hard to just do a brush stroke because even as we just mentioned in identifying these various properties that the chair identified, the Leggett is now fully leased, but it has some challenges initially. The Lindley, yes, now it's in the back. A part of this budget that's proposed is a larger banner for the Lindley to create some wayfinding and to stand it out more meaningfully in that complex that it's in. And so there's different circumstances for each property. We're really taking a very individualized approach. And as it pertains to the debt service coverage ratio, do believe that once we get our occupancy and our lease enforcement complete, we'll be in a much better posture.
And then just one related question, going back earlier to something Terry said, with the lease enforcement, we have talked a lot about the court system. I don't know, this is the first time I recall you bringing up the sheriff's office. And I'm curious, and you said you talked about negative impacts, and I didn't know if that was referring to both the court system as well as the sheriff's office and what's going on there.
Yes, and it's possible that property management can expand further, but in recent discussions, those are some of the explanations that have been provided where not intentionally negatively impacting us, but paper gets lost. And so you can't serve papers and then you have to go back to the beginning, or there's a change in the court. So this is not intended to say that there are purposeful impacts from either the courts or the sheriffs, but it is the reality with the amount of lease enforcement that is occurring, not just with HOC, but with other landlords, that things happen that negatively impact. And so many times we've been asked, well, what's the normal time frame to go through this process? And I don't know that normal exists at this moment.
I'll also add there was a shift in terms of the requirements from the sheriff's office as it pertains to moving out someone who's evicted. They changed their policy, will not allow your own staff to accompany the sheriff's office in that process. And as a result, you must bring on a third party. And there's a certain number of individuals, and I don't recall it specifically, but there's a ratio that's higher than the ratio we initially would deploy. So we would previously allow our maintenance staff and or our property manager to accompany the sheriff's office if belongings were being removed from a property. There's now a requirement that you outsource and that you have X number of individuals join you in that. And that is a higher expense than we previously.
What's the rationale behind?
I believe that they're trying to ensure that there's a step removed from the property. And other than that, I'm not certain. But and also I'm not very clear on why the number of individuals that must be present has increased. But that definitely was a policy shift that happened last year.
Are there things we can be doing to work with the sheriff's office more to expedite?
And I can definitely circle back with more intel. I'm not certain if they would change their overall policy for our properties versus the policy that they're now deploying across the county, but stay tuned. I'll circle back.
Was that requirement a statutory, the outsourcing and ratio?
It was a new policy that the sheriff's office deployed. I'd have to see and look to see if the court also incorporated that in their orders. But it definitely was not a statutory change. It might have been a policy and procedural change and could be supported by the judge's orders and or the sheriff's office. Yes.
One observation, since I've served on the commission, is that I can certainly say that decisions that you have made as a president in terms of engaging and hiring staff on the agency, we're in a much better position now to deal with how we can handle these different externalities that come that we don't control. And I feel very confident that our staff is in fact able to look at properties in a very different way in terms of how we can, from an asset management standpoint, from a management everyday standpoint, from use of personnel. I just want to say that while we raise questions sometimes, that I also want to be acknowledged that the fact that we are in a much better capacity to be able to adjust to industrial changes that occur to impact our portfolio. So I want to acknowledge that as well.
Thank
You know, I've always appreciated Terry always being able to explain a lot of this stuff. And sometimes I worry that she is being put in a position to sometimes answer questions by herself, but from a budget standpoint, they really go to our staffing stuff. You know what I mean? Pull that guy up here and let me talk to him.
Well, he's here on standby and definitely is prepared. Vice President Ross is right behind me and is prepared to answer questions as needed.
It is a team, and you will see many times I will look to Chelsea because that is a question that is better addressed by our president versus your budget officer.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I just want to acknowledge that too.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just two short ones. The first one is I have much troubles getting my head around the LASCO because it's a project-based Section 8, 12 units, and why it's kind of always at a loss. And I guess I have a couple of theories. And one is it's a small property for a difficult population, and maybe the FMR's contract rents are too low.
Yeah, there are a couple of issues with the property is 12 units. It has an elevator for 12 units. So that is a very high contract cost. There are also, and I don't recall the precipice of what was required, but there are very high landscaping requirements for the outside of the property. So for a property that size, the grounds and landscaping costs are significantly higher than you would experience. And so when you have those two large contracts competing against 12 units, supporting residents at the 30%, it's very difficult. We do appreciate that we do have the support of the county grant to pay for the resident services at the property, but the property also is unique in that it has one staff member that not only provides services to the resident, but is also the property manager at the property. So the structure there is very unique to that property. We are limited, as you acknowledged, by the rents, and there are certain maintenance contracts that are required that you would not typically see at a property that size. There,
most residents don't have much income, so the Section 8, the collection of rents is not a big issue.
Right.
But if there's one, for example, there's one vacant unit right now. And so then all of a sudden the occupancy looks awful at Lasco Manor. So because it's so small, if there is a shift, and it's not necessarily because not unpayment of rent, it could be that an individual moved or another circumstance, but that definitely can make an impact in terms of projections. And we of course turn the unit quickly, et cetera. But we're looking very closely again, even as it pertains to how we approach some of these contracts for landscaping that may apply to multiple properties. Just economies of scale is really where we're headed in terms of how we leverage our relationships with various maintenance service providers.
And so we're able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's easy to follow. We've already shared this.
Oh, Commissioner Weech, you're muted.
So sorry. We have already shared these proposed budgets with our partners pending commission approval is what the documents said.
the budgets are actually submitted to the partners by November 1st.
Mhm.
So following this meeting, we will share the budgets to each of the limited partners. Our requirement is to share them by November 1st. And again, it is contingent upon commission approval. If they were to require a change and that came in after commission approval, we would come back with a budget amendment.
Thank you. You mooted my question. I was going to ask what kind of feedback we were getting from our partners. but they haven't gotten the budget yet.
Some of them have because
Uh-huh.
they were involved in the development, specifically with the Laureate and Basuto. But they are required to be submitted by November 1st. And one last thing for Lasco Manor, similar to Dale Drive, which is part of our agency budget, this property is permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals. So it is a very unique property in that.
On that, because I was recalling that, and I was just curious with the landscaping, is that a feature of the property, or is that in some way connected to the population? Like, are there?
I don't believe it's the population. There were certain requirements, and I would have to go back to when the property was first financed. It was part of the development budget to put in place the initial landscaping, but it does have high maintenance costs year to year because of that. We can get back to you with further information, but it would require the research of what initialized that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Yeah,
And
I
now you
just want
got,
to mention one more thing on the capital, and this is very brief. The last page, page 15 of the packet, when capital budgets are proposed, an analysis is done to ensure that each property has sufficient reserves to support the capital budget, not only of the current year, but future years. And all of the budgets do have sufficient capital with reserves, with the exception of the Lindley. This is the same that we experienced last year. We did increase the RFR contribution based on the proposed budget, which meant that it would come into this year with no available RFR. So the contribution is set to support the full budget. And that budget does include the signage that President Andrews mentioned so that we can make the property more visible to those in the area. So that does decrease the debt service coverage ratio because replacement reserves are part of that calculation. And basically the replacement reserve increased about 43,000, which is almost doubling the required reserve at the property. And that is the end of my presentation in case there's further questions.
any other questions? Thank you very much. This is an item that's provided to us. We don't require any action as far as information to Budget and Finance Committee. So we go to the next item, which is our fiscal year 2027. Wow. County operating budget. We're already into 27.
Yeah. Commissioners, thank you so much. This is an item that comes before the commission and then subsequently is advanced to our county partners as our request for their support for the work that we do. Our budget officer will explain that this is a twofold process. We talk about operating. We also have a capital improvements. You might recall conversations around that. Today, we're going to focus in on the operating budget request. I will say and just highlight that this is where the county has been a huge asset for us and really strong supporter. It is with the county's support that we have a resident services division. And as you know, and as members of the public may now know, HOC does not receive funds from HUD as it pertains to resident services. Our resident services staff is funded through the county budget process. And so last year we were successful in advocating for additional work years for our resident services team, who has really done a tremendous job in terms of servicing not only our residents, but the 40,000 people on our wait list. This year, we're asking for additional support as it pertains to one of the programs that has been a vital program for the fathers in this county and has been a tremendous reflection of the great work that we've done, and that is our Fatherhood Initiative. That grant wound down. We weren't awarded the grant for the next renewal year. And while disappointed about that, we have been able to chart a path forward in terms of continuing this program that has really help so many fathers and families. And so our request you will hear today is for the county to help supplement so that we can continue this program and continue to make it a viable program for all the fathers. This is actually last year, we expanded the Fatherhood Initiative to include not just HOC fathers, but fathers across the county. And you will also hear a request for support as it pertains to our new headquarters. Of course, we're excited to move into our new headquarters here at the end of this year. A part of that building, of course, will have staff from resident services, in particular, our staff that support our permanent supportive housing population. And we're asking for some support in regards to the costs affiliated there, as well as some of the parking expenses that we will incur as we move into the new headquarters that we don't currently experience here in Kensington. And so as the presentation is provided, definitely I'll be open to answer questions. I will turn it over now to our finance team and to Terry Fowler, our budget officer.
Thank you, President Andrews. For the commissioner's information, we are on page 1. The operating budget season with OMB has a staggered submission. Again, they did this for fiscal 26. Our operating budget is actually due by October 31st. It is typical that our cycle of commission meetings and the county cycle do not coincide, and the county has been very cooperative in adjusting our due date to allow for commission approval. So we have received approval to submit after the November meeting. The county kicked off the season on September 24th. And as is typical in any year, the agency is required to submit a budget that is equal to what the approved budget is currently for fiscal 26. And that's approximately $9.2 million. You can see in the packet the breakout of how those funds are utilized. Over 82% of the $9.2 million directly supports our resident services staff, and most of that is personnel costs with additional programming costs included in it. In addition to the mark, staff will submit a request for an adjustment totaling approximately $379,000, and that is for the anticipated increase in salaries and benefits related to the approximate 52 work years that are funded by the county contract. If we move to page 3 of the packet, as President Andrew mentioned, in addition to the mark and the typical request to make whole the staff cost, staff is proposing 2 new requests, as mentioned, that total $2.89 million. There is a typo in the package that will be corrected for the commission meeting, and that is for replacement funding for the Fatherhood Initiative grant and the agency initiative. If we move to page 4 of the packet, you can see that the total submission for FY27 that we are requesting your support to take to the commission is approximately $12.4 million. That includes the continuation of the current mark, the request of $379,000 for changes in retirement, health, and compensation for those staff paid by the county. I do want to also mention that part of this reimburses the agency for the rental license fees that we have to pay on all of our properties. And over the last couple of years, the HCA has been increasing that cost. We did reach out to DHCA, and at the time we reached out, they do not know whether they will put an increase in. If they do, it will be in their submission, and we will then add that increased cost as an adjustment later once that is known. But at this time, we have not been given an increase for that. And then we have the 2 competition list items of approximately $2.9 million funding for the Fatherhood Initiative Program is approximately $617,000. Funding to support the agency headquarters is approximately $2.3 million. This packet will go to the commission, and we are requesting your support for that movement. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address that.
Questions? Jeff?
Just mentioned for the Fatherhood Initiative, which would be great if we were able to continue that. We're suggesting, as you mentioned, this as the county support this potential supplement. And have we identified some source that would, or Chelsea, I thought you had referenced it as a supplement. I wasn't
It
sure.
should be replacement because we do not have federal funding.
Okay, it would, so we don't have like another partial source.
So what we've done in the meantime is to absorb the staff from Fatherhood Initiative in our current resident services personnel, ultimately backfilling positions that were vacant temporarily. We're asking for 3 additional work years so that we can have our full complement in resident services, as well as have the 3 individuals for the Fatherhood Initiative. We have wonderful partners who actually provide the resources for the Fatherhood Initiative in terms of programming. Those partners remain, and we actually have a cohort that we will move forward with and leverage those partners to provide those resources. The ongoing support will be needed, however, for these work years as we advance. And so that's what's reflected in this request.
Okay. And do we have a sense of the county's openness to this request?
They have not received the request. I will mention, as Chelsea mentioned earlier, is that we have a request for capital improvements, and we had a meeting yesterday with the Office of Budget and Management and Operating, and many of the requests all depend on current revenue. And therefore, similar to last year, although they are 2 different budget cycles, the county will be looking at both requests when they are analyzing their available current revenue for next year. I would not venture a guess of how the county will receive it. But at this point, they are not aware of our request unless they're watching us today.
I was going to make that little underline. Unless they're watching us today.
I'm sure they are. Must watch streaming.
Other question? Good.
No.
Question which naturally flows from that discussion is the largest amount of the request is for costs associated with the headquarters. What happens if the county does not approve our request?
We'll bear the full cost of the headquarters. It's in the budget now. We have it in the FY26 budget for the 6 months that we will be occupying the building. But going forward, that full cost is there. But I will remind you that one of the reasons why we feel strongly of this request is that this headquarters is a county building. And it has been 15 years since they first wanted us to return the building, and we had asked the county for a headquarters in a CIP request many years ago. That did not get funded, and instead we opened 2 customer service centers. But again, it takes our agency and spreads us out all over and not having a real headquarters. So this building would be returned to the county and could be used for any of their purposes. So it is a reminder that the building is returned. We are the agency that's supporting the most vulnerable, and we hope that that will be well received.
I'll also note that our relationship with the county, they do support with contribution annually for 880 Bonafit. And that's one of our customer service centers. So we're emulating that request for this new building. And as I shared before, we are going to incur additional parking expenses, which is significant. We're working with the county to explore the potential of maybe a master lease. But if we had full staff coming into headquarters and we're covering all of the expense, it would be close to $500,000 a year. And so that additional expense needs some offset and some support from the county. The way the county has approached this with other agencies is that they will ultimately put funding in that budget for that agency that helps pay the parking district's expenses instead of reducing the parking costs. And so we're structuring our requests to be similar to how they have approached other county agencies in terms of parking. We're also exploring, of course, we have a bike rack and a shower as required, and we're in walking distance to the metro, and really trying to encourage our employees to use alternative methods to get to the office. But it will be an expense that we have not had to bear in the same manner with our current headquarters.
Do we have any kind of transit subsidy for our employees?
Not as it stands, because as it stands, most of our properties do not have this additional expense for parking. Most of our offices. So EDP, which is out in Gaithersburg, there's free in it's our own land. At Durwood, there's a set aside of parking that we built in the Laureate that does not require that we pay for parking. At our 880, we actually pay for 31 parking spaces and pay on a monthly basis close to $5,000 or $6,000 for parking for our staff there. And so here, of course, that would be much more. And so that's where, and at 880, there's not public transportation. It's not right next to the metro, although it will be when the Purple Line appears.
Yeah, no, I imagine, to the extent that we could lower some of our parking expenses and help the environment through encouraging and providing some support to our employees with a transit subsidy, that might be something to look at.
Absolutely. And I think in this particular circumstance, that's where it might be most. This property and this headquarters is located in a place where a transportation subsidy would make sense. The other properties, not so much.
Sure.
And so we have a reach out to WMATA as well to see if we can work with WMATA in terms of some potential bulk discounts there as well. This also will require a conversation with the union.
I know that the headquarters building is located in close proximity to your county garage.
That's the garage I'm speaking of.
Yeah. And so I know at one point in time, there had been some discussions when we were in the formative stage of thinking about the headquarters building, of having some arrangement with the county related to a certain percentage of those parking spaces in the garage being dedicated to us using for the headquarters building. I don't know where that ever went to, but I know it's conversations about it.
The conversation is very active. What I've been advised is that we cannot have designated parking spaces because it is a public garage. However, I am working through with the team a potential alternative that would allow for us to have a bulk number of parking passes, and trying to explore, and hence this request, how the county can potentially supplement that. Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? Can I get a motion to approve the staff's recommendation to advance this to the full commission?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. So ordered. And
Thank you.
thank you. And let me go back to the earlier action. We were talking about the 2026 and get a motion to approve transmitting that to the full commission.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. So ordered. So those are two actions that we had on the agenda for today. Any other matters that come before us? If
At
not,
this time, thank you very
we
much.
will officially adjourn as of 10:50 a.m.
Thank
you
you.
very much.